Hey there, independent Scientologists. Discover a new perspective to your bridge by visiting ao-gp.org. Get in session with remote auditing using the theta meter. Are you curious about where you stand? Head on over to ao-gp.org now and take our free personality test. Join the growing group of independent Scientologists today.
Hi, and welcome to another AOGP Outside of the Church podcast. This is season 8, episode 16. This will be the first ever solo podcast that we've done. This is going to be a continuation of our episodes on what happened to Scientology. This is going to be the year 1972. And I'm just going to make some commentary on some of these particular things that happened, and we'll try and get through these years because, boy, there's a lot of stuff that occurred in the early 70s in the Nixon era, but it all dovetails together interestingly well. So let's start out with January 1972. This is something good to listen to while you're, doing something else in the background, and you go, interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Because it's this huge puzzle. So January 1972, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunter are collaborating on a political espionage plan to replace the sand wedge proposal. We mentioned that in the last podcast about this. One of the items they factored into the budget ostensibly for political espionage is a chase plane. Monday, the 10th of January, 1972, G. Gordon Liddy is in New York City at the apartment Ulasewicz had established at 321 East 48th Street, apartment 11C. These are cited incidents. Wednesday, the 12th of January, 1972, G. Gordon Liddy is still in New York City. Ingo Swann learns that two men in suits flashing credentials have visited the ASPR facility investigating him. They've met with Dr. Ossis and have looked at the experiment rooms and some of the experiment results. Ossis tells Swann that he isn't free to tell Swann what was discussed. So clearly they threatened him with something that he didn't want to tell Ingo. Friday, 14 January 1972, the origin date of a Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, report, Controlled Offensive Behavior, USSR, is published. January 25th, 1972, Buell Mullen tells Ingo Swann that a small group of her high-placed friends has begun establishing a pool of money for Swann. Already some $70,000 has been pledged, quote unquote, from several sources, quote unquote. Monday, the 31st of January, 1972, information cutoff date, quote unquote, for a 1972 DIA report entitled Controlled Offensive Behavior, USSR, concerning Soviet research and development of PSI or PSYOPs technologies. E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy returned from a weekend trip to Los Angeles, during which Liddy has also gone to San Diego and back. Note that Dr. Augustine B. Kinzel has a home just outside San Diego, so that's probably who they went and saw. Early February 1972, Buell Mullen calls Ingo Swann to say that Dr. Augustus B. Kinzel will be in New York City on the 17th of February with, quote unquote, some friends who want to meet with Swann. She's having a dinner party for the occasion. Swann says he'll be there. Also, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt fly to Miami, home of Bernard Baker and other CIA-connected Cubans. G. Gordon Liddy recruits CIA's James McCord, who we've mentioned in earlier podcasts on this topic, as a wireman, quote unquote, purportedly to be able to do electronic eavesdropping for political espionage purposes. It's interesting to note at the time, Liddy has no approved budget for any such activities, nor are there any approved plans for or targets for any such activities. More on this here in a little bit. Thursday, the 17th of February, 1972, at a dinner at Buell Mullen's home in New York, Dr. Kinzel has brought four quote-unquote friends in suits who Kinzel will only introduce to Swann by first names. They have a 1-hour meeting that is quote-unquote strictly confidential concerning, quote, big-time funding for a new research organization, unquote. That's separate from the $70,000 already collected. According to Swann, at least one of the friends is CIA. Go figure. On or about the same date, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy again fly to Miami, ostensibly to meet with Donald Segretti, a.k.a. Donald Simmons, quote unquote. While there, Hunt is in contact with CIA's Bernard Baker. Then on Tuesday, the 22nd of February, 1972, Ingo Swann, who was OT7 at the time, original OT7 at the time, performs the first of a series of out-of-body experiments with Vera Feldman of the ASPR as the outbound experimenter. Swann is hooked up to brainwave leads and locked in the OOB room, while Feldman goes to the Museum of Natural History a few blocks away. Swann gets a high number of hits, quote unquote, on what Feldman is seeing, one of them being a display case full of gemstones. Swann and Feldman talk about ESP being used for psychic spying. Also on that day, G. Gordon Liddy meets with the CIA in connection with CIA special clearances he has been granted. Thursday, 24th September, Thursday, 24th February, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt meet with a retired CIA doctor. This doctor, introduced by Hunt to Liddy as Dr. Edward Gunn, is to get briefed by him on various covert means of murder for possible assassination. Note, although Liddy and Hunt relate many similar incidents, if disjointedly in their respective autobiographies, Hunt mentions nothing about this incident in his, while Liddy devotes several pages to it. Interesting. Late February 1972. Now, it's also important to note that Liddy and Hunt named the gemstones they are engaged in gemstone, which is a packet of information. So they got the gemstones right as a test as to whether he could exteriorize and name these gemstones, so on and so forth. Late February 1972, Ingo Swann, connected with ASPR, meets with Dr. Robert D. Erickson, Executive Director of Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship, SFF. Note, Chicago's W. Clement Stone is a member and major contributor to both the SFF and ASPR. About 2 months later, E. Howard Hunt will deliver an undisclosed amount of cash in a sealed envelope to the W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation in Chicago. One of the members of the board of ASPR, A.C. Twitchell Jr., purportedly calls Ingo Swann early in the morning, saying there is a move afoot at the ASPR to have Swann ejected on the grounds that he is a Scientologist. Twitchell says that it has been circulating that Swann is Hubbard's spy. That's interesting because it's the reverse flow, and is seeking to take over the ASPR on Hubbard's behalf. Swann threatens to sue the board over his civil rights. E. Howard Hunt travels to Nicaragua on an undisclosed mission, quote unquote. Wednesday, 1 March 1972, Russell Targ, we haven't heard about him in a while, Charles T. Tart, and David Hart release a proposal entitled Research on Techniques to Enhance Extrasensory Perception. On or about the same date, Douglas Caddy begins to do, quote, legal tasks, unquote, for G. Gordon Liddy. Friday, 3rd March 1972, Gary O. Morris, psychiatrist of E. Howard Hunt's wife, Dorothy, this is interesting, vanishes while on vacation on the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. No traces ever found of the pleasure boat he had left on for a cruise with his wife and a local captain, Mervyn Augustin. Just poof, disappeared. What a coincidence. Wednesday, 15 March 1972, a memorandum is sent to Director of FBI J. Edgar Hoover from the legal attaché, LEGAT for short in big capital letters, Copenhagen, titled Subject L. Ron Hubbard. It says on 13 March 1972, and then blacked out, obviously this is an FOA document, advised that he has not yet completed preparation of his report concerning the Scientology organization and its operations in Denmark. He reiterated, however, that when completed, a copy of this report will be designated for, and this is blacked out also, contact will be maintained with, blacked out, in order to ensure that this office receives copies of his report and Bureau will be kept advised. Then on the 20th of March, 1972, OT7, Ingo Swann, again, is at Cleve Baxter's lab in New York. Baxter hands some papers to Swann on Hal Putoff and purportedly says, you two might get along. He's into Scientology too. Note, both Hal Putoff and Ingo Swann have been connected with Yvonne Gilliam at the Celebrity Center, CC, for some time. Both also are OT7s, and the only place in the United States delivering the OT levels is the Advanced Organization in LA, AOLA, where Yvonne has been the senior executive before starting Celebrity Center. So that's an interesting tie-in. Very interesting. Wednesday, the 22nd of March, 1972, Janet Mitchell writes regarding out-of-body brightness comparison experiments with Ingo Swann, saying, quote, it may be possible that he can see all the waves in the atmosphere from infrared to ultraviolet. On Monday, the 27th of March, 1972, G. Gordon Liddy's job abruptly changes to general counsel of the Finance Committee to re-elect the president. This is Nixon. Wednesday, 29 March 1972, 2 days after Liddy's job change, E. Howard Hunt, quote unquote, terminates in his paid capacity as a White House consultant. Yet he keeps his office and the safe he'd used as such and keeps his White House credentials because he continues to, quote, work there for a few hours each week at the White House. Thursday, 30 March 1972, the day after E. Howard Hunt's official disconnection from the White House, Ingo Swann contacts Hal Putoff saying Cleve Baxter, quote, has suggested, unquote, for Swann to contact Putoff. Swann has several phone conversations over several days with Putoff, who suggests that Swann come out to Stanford Research Institute, SRI, for a couple of weeks to do some experiments. Now, in early April 1972, E. Howard Hunt flies to Chicago and delivers an undisclosed amount of cash in a sealed envelope to W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation. Then on Tuesday, the 4th of April, 1972, Ingo Swann receives word that an independent judge, blind to the fact that she was judging an experiment in out-of-body perceptions, has correctly matched all 8 of the former, quote, picture drawings trials. 100% match between out-of-body drawings and the contents of the target trays. Then on the 7th of April, 3 days later, LRH gives 3 taped lectures to students on the expanded Dianetics course. They are the last public lectures Hubbard ever will give, ever. Note, as of this date, L. Ron Hubbard had given over 1,300 public lectures since 1950, averaging a little over 1 a week. And it's interesting to note, and this isn't in this timeline, but in 1971-72, LRH was ridiculously busy with the L's, the data evaluators course. Expanded Dianetics came towards the end of that, which was as an end result of his L's research. There are some of those people out there that say that they contributed to the L's. I've seen some things on Facebook regarding this. Whether it's true or not, I can either confirm or deny that. But it was a very, very, very busy time for him, especially in establishing flag in Clearwater. There was talk about opening a flag in Denver at one point in time. Outside of Denver, they looked at a couple of places, 2 in Florida, one of which became flag. One was in Sarasota, and the other one was in Clearwater, and then there was one outside of Denver. And Clearwater won out. So this was all going on in 71-72. Now, back to our timeline. Monday, 10 April 1972, a court ruling this date by the United States Court of Appeals, 8th Circuit in St. Paul, Minnesota, allows the U.S. federal government, remember those e-meters they took a couple years ago? Allows the U.S. federal government to keep a shipment of Scientology e-meters that had been seized by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare on the basis of, quote, improper labeling, unquote, putting an unknown number of e-meters in permanent custody and possession of federal agencies. Government. Saturday, 15 April 1972, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy fly to Miami and deliver checks drawn on a Mexico City bank to CIA's Bernard Barker. Note, several of the checks have originated from Gulf Resources and Chemical Corporation in Houston, which at the time controls half the world's supply of lithium, used in the making of hydrogen bombs in in psychiatric drugs. Let me read that again. This is ridiculous. Several of the checks have originated from Gulf Resources and Chemical Corporation in Houston, which at the time controls half the world's supply of lithium, used in the making of hydrogen bombs and in psychiatric drugs. Yeah. Okay. Monday, 17 April 1972, physicist Dr. Russell Targ meets with the CIA personnel from the Office of Strategic Intelligence, OSI again, and discusses the subject of paranormal abilities. Films of Soviets moving inanimate objects by mental powers are made available to an analyst from OSI. Then, 3 days later, on Thursday, the 20th of April, CIA Office of Strategic Intelligence personnel who have been briefed by Russell contact personnel from the Office of Research and Development, ORD, and Technical Services Division, TSD, regarding films and reports of Soviet investigations into psychokinesis. Note, although the name of the CIA's Technical Services Department later changes to Office of Technical Services, some sources anachronistically refer to TSD as OTS when it was still TSD. The name isn't officially changed until November 1972, a few months later. Monday, 24 April 1972, Bernard Barker cashes a cashier's check for $25,000 at his bank in Miami. Note, this $25,000 from the Dahlberg check plus 2 later withdrawals by Barker will equal $114,000. More on this in May, the 2nd and 8th of May later this year. On 1 May 1972, Russell Targas joined the Stanford Research Institute and visited by a CIA Office of Research and Development. Project officer. Targ proposes that some psychokinetic verification investigations can be done at SRI in conjunction with Scientology OT7 Hal Putoff. CIA's James McCord contacts an ex-FBI agent, Alfred Baldwin, who is living in Connecticut. McCord purportedly doesn't know Baldwin, but wants Baldwin to come to Washington, D.C. that night. Just come to Washington, D.C. Tuesday, 2nd May, 1972, J. Edgar Hoover is found dead in his home in the early morning hours. L. Patrick Gray, who has no background in law enforcement, is appointed as acting director of FBI. That's interesting. Note, Hoover's death is attributed to a heart attack and no autopsy is done. L. Patrick Gray later will destroy material taken from the White House safe of E. Howard Hunt, then will resign. Somebody had something to hide. CIA's Bernard Baker withdraws an unspecified amount of cash from his bank in Miami. Note, this is the second of 3 transactions by Barker that will total $114,000 that we just mentioned. After Baldwin meets with James McCord, McCord issues Baldwin a Smith & Wesson .38 snub nose revolver. Baldwin is assigned to travel as a bodyguard with Martha Mitchell on a, quote, trip to the Midwest, unquote. Then on Wednesday, 3 May, next day, 1972, Ingo Swann performs an experiment that he says, quote, scared the bejesus out of the experimenters in parapsychology as well. In it, Swann perceives not just things the 2 outbound beacons, quote unquote, are seeing, but also senses confusion in them. When they come back and confirm that they had gotten lost in some construction work being done in the Museum of Natural History, one says with concern, quote, does this mean you can read our minds too? CIA's Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, and Felipe Del Diego arrive in Washington, D.C. from Miami and meet with G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. The next day, 4 May 1972, Lieutenant George Bush is ordered to, quote, report to Commander 111 FIS Ellington Air Force Base not later than 14 May 1972. Note, Bush does not report as ordered. We'll get more on that on the 19th of May. Friday, May 1972, CIA's James McCord rents room 419 of the Howard Johnson's Motel across the street from the Watergate. The room is registered in the name of McCord Associates. 3 days later, Monday, 8 May 1972, Alfred Baldwin returns to Washington, D.C. from his trip with Martha Mitchell. He's told by James McCord to keep the .38 revolver because, quote, he might be going on another trip. Meanwhile, G. Gordon Liddy in D.C. calls CIA's Bernard Barker in Miami. Bernard Barker withdraws another unspecified amount of cash from his bank in Miami, which with 2 other transactions now totals $114,000. James McCord receives $4,000 in cash from G. Gordon Liddy. Then, the next week, on Tuesday, the 9th of May, Alfred Baldwin leaves Washington, D.C., ostensibly going to his home in Connecticut to get, quote-unquote, more clothes. He takes the .38 revolver with him, purportedly because he has been told by James McCord that he might be going on another trip with Martha Mitchell that is scheduled for 11 May 1972. Obviously, either to protect himself or otherwise. Note, Baldwin doesn't return until 12 May 1972, 3 days later. Now, it's also important to note, though not all on this timeline, cash payouts to CIA's James McCord will total at least $71,000. So James McCord on the 10th of May, that next day, is in Rockville, Maryland. He pays $3,500 cash for a device capable of receiving intercepted wire and oral communications. Note, Rockville, Maryland is about 6 miles from Laurel, Maryland. 5 days later, presidential candidate George Wallace will be shot in Laurel, Maryland by Arthur Bremer with a .38 caliber revolver. What a coinkydink. Friday, 12 May 1972, Alfred Baldwin returns to Washington, D.C. James McCord tells Baldwin he won't be going with Martha Mitchell so he can, quote, turn in his gun, unquote. Baldwin purportedly gives the .38 revolver to McCord. McCord tells Baldwin to move from the Roger Smith Hotel, where Baldwin has been staying, into room 419 at the Howard Johnson's Motel that we mentioned earlier. Presidential candidate George Wallace is shot by Arthur Bremer in Laurel, Maryland, ending his presidential campaign and partially paralyzing him. I vaguely remember this as a kid. Wednesday, 17 May 1972, CIA's Bernard Barker makes 2 calls from Miami to G. Gordon Liddy and 2 calls to CIA's E. Howard Hunt. A memorandum is sent to Acting Director of FBI L. Patrick Gray from the legal attaché Madrid titled, quote, Subject L. Ron Hubbard, FPC, unquote. It says, enclosed for information and completion of Bureau and Legat Copenhagen files, and 1 copy of a memorandum dated 4/26/72, a little less than a month prior, received from the FOIA blacked out. Then 2 days later, Friday, 19 May 1972, and we said we would get to this, Lieutenant George Bush Jr. contacts a superior officer in the reserves to discuss, quote, options of how Bush can get out of coming to drill from now through November, unquote. The memo recording the conversation says that Bush, quote, is working on another campaign for his dad, unquote. This is Bush Sr., Daddy Bush. The memo writer thinks Bush is, quote, also talking to someone upstairs, unquote. No, George H. Bush Sr. is the U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time. Now, President Nixon, about to embark on a historic trip to the Soviet Union, writes the following in a letter to Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, quote, the performance in the psychological welfare field is nothing short of disgraceful. The mountain has labored for 7 weeks, and when it finally produced, it produced not much more than a mouse. Or to put it more honestly, it produced a rat. We finally have a program now underway, but it totally lacks imagination, and I have no confidence whatsoever, that the bureaucracy will carry it out. I do not simply blame Richard Helms and the CIA. After all, they do not support my policies because they basically are, for the most part, Ivy League and Georgetown Society oriented, unquote. So there was obviously some infighting on who should do what and who was from where in these colleges and things like that. E. Howard Hunt makes 2 calls to Bernard Barker in Miami also on 19 May 1972. Saturday, 20 May, the next day, Richard Nixon leaves Washington, D.C. on his trip to Austria, the Soviet Union, Iran, and Poland. He will not return until 1 June 1972, almost 10 days later. James McCord sends Alfred Baldwin to Andrews Air Force Base, where Nixon is leaving on Air Force One, purportedly because there might be demonstrations and McCord wants Baldwin to be there for more surveillance activities, unquote, quote unquote. Note the reason, quote unquote, supplied by McCord in testimony for this trip by Baldwin is too thin to slice, particularly in light of the amount of security surrounding Nixon's departure. Besides Air Force One, there's a fleet of White House planes at Andrews Air Force Base for use by VIPs and various staff connected with the White House. On or about the same day, CIA's E. Howard Hunt flies to Miami and meets with Bernard Barker. That following Monday, 22 May 1972, Richard Nixon arrives in Moscow and is toasting Soviet leaders at a dinner. The CIA Cuban contingent, quote unquote, arrives in Washington, D.C. from Miami. Bernard Barker, Frank Sturgis, Eugenio Martinez, and Virgilio Gonzalez. They are in D.C. purportedly to carry out a first break-in, quote unquote, on the following weekend of the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate, with G. Gordon Liddy, CIA's E. Howard Hunt, and CIA's James McCord. There's no physical evidence that any such quote-unquote first break-in ever took place. For full coverage, see the Watergate first break-in. Note also that while E. Howard Hunt claims that 6 Cubans arrived on 22nd May 1972, the reference criminal appeals court ruling names only 4. Then, The following day, 23rd May 1972, a memorandum is sent to Acting Director, FBI, L. Patrick Gray. That's the guy that took over for our cross-dresser, previous head of FBI. You know who I'm talking about. Copenhagen, titled Subject L100 FBC. It says, Mr. Victor Wolf Jr., U.S. Consul, American Embassy, Copenhagen, advised on May 15, 1972, that he has not yet found time to repair the report referred to in Relet concerning the Scientology organization. Mr. Wolf stated that he hopes to devote attention to this matter in a short time. This case will be placed in pending inactive status for a period of 90 days. Also, Alfred Baldwin leaves Washington, D.C. on the same date, 23 May, again purportedly going to his home in Connecticut again. No reason is given for his departure. Friday, 26 May, later that week, G. Gordon Liddy, Alfred Baldwin, Howard Hunt, and James McCord, and several of the Cubans, contract agents purportedly are engaged, all of them are contract agents, are engaged in a failed attempt to break into the Watergate, the Emeritus dinner attempt. That next day, Saturday, G. Gordon Liddy, Baldwin, E. Howard Hunt, CIA's James McCord, and these Cubans, this is, I'm reading the same thing. It's in here. No, it's second. Then they do a second failed attempt. There we go, to break into the Watergate. But there's no evidence of there ever being a first. So the first was the second, basically. Sunday, 28 May, the next day, G. Gordon Liddy, Baldwin, Hunt, McCord, the Cubans, purportedly are engaged in a successful break-in at the DNC headquarters at the Watergate, according to their later claims. McCord placed 2 electronic bugs in the DNC headquarters during the first break-in, and Bernard Barker purportedly had photos taken of the office of the chairman, Lawrence O'Brien, and of the documents on his desk. Note, there is no physical evidence that any such first break-in ever took place, or the purported 2 earlier failed attempts on the same holiday weekend. Barker later testified that he never was in O'Brien's office at all, and a telephone company sweep found no electronic bugs in the DNC at all. For full coverage, see Watergate first break-in. There's nothing to account for the whereabouts of Liddy, Hunt, McCord, and Baldwin over the entire Memorial Day weekend, except the conflicting and contradictory anecdotal accounts of the co-conspirators themselves, which they volunteered when caught, quote-unquote, inside the building on the 17th of June, 1972. See also 3 September 1971 for similarities in the purported, quote, fielding office break-in, unquote, including personnel involved in the use of a holiday weekend, in that case, the Labor Day weekend. The crew of the Scientology flagship Apollo, on the same day, 28 May 1972, are told that L. Ron Hubbard was, quote, moved on shore, unquote, his bodyguard, the same Green Beret, Paul Preston, with his bodyguard. Note, from this date until his reported death in 1986, LRH never makes another public appearance, not one. His whereabouts generally are unknown, except to keep a few close people who later claimed that while with them, he had been either, quote, in hiding, unquote, or on the run, quote, unquote, or ill the entire time, including donning various disguises. Monday, 29 May 1972. Ingo Swann is told by psychiatrist Carlos Ossis that there are to be, quote, no more remote viewing experiments at the ASPR, unquote. The reason is given Swann calls fellow Scientology OT7 Hal Putoff at SRI and offers to come out. 4 June 1972, a few days later, Ingo Swann flies from New York to San Francisco, where he is met by OT7 Hal Putoff and taken to SRI. The 6th of June, 2 days later, Ingo mentally affects a supercooled magnetometer encased in solid concrete 5 feet beneath the foundation of the Varian Hall of Physics at Stanford University, witnessed by Dr. Arthur Hubbard, Dr. Marshall Lee, and representatives of the CIA. On the 7th of June, the next day, Willis Harman meets Ingo Swann at SRI and takes Swann to a meeting where there are 16 people. Harman is director of his own educational policy research center at SRI, a center for futurology, quote unquote, at the time. Futurology constitutes one of the most important and biggest efforts in the world, and Harman is well connected in Washington, D.C., with offices there. Harman explains to Swann at the meeting that part of their ongoing project is to see if parapsychology, and or psychic abilities can or should be factored into quote unquote future scenarios. Harmon explains that all was known about the ASPR's goings on and that the attempt to expel Swann, quote, gives you more credentials than you realize and also makes it easier for various people, unquote. The next day, Thursday, 8 June 1972, Ingo Swann goes to the home of Kirlian researcher Bill Tiller and there meets a psychiatrist. Boy, I cannot talk this morning. Psychiatrist Shafika Corrigula. That's why I saw that coming. Friday, 9 June 1972, the next day, Ingo Swann leaves SRI and returns to New York City. John Paul Vann, who had been closely involved with Lucien Conan and Daniel Ellsberg in Vietnam, contemporaneously with Green Bay Beret Paul Preston, is killed in a bizarre helicopter crash in Vietnam. Interesting. G. Gordon Liddy purportedly has a private meeting with Magruder where they purportedly discuss problems with, quote, the room monitoring device, unquote, in the DNC and the prospects of, quote, another entry, unquote, into the Watergate. Note, there is no, quote, room monitoring device, unquote, in the DNC. So this is conflicting reports. That following Monday, the 12th of June, 1972, Ingo Swann agrees to return to the ASPR for further research and experiments. Also, Jeb Magruder purportedly has another private meeting with G. Gordon Liddy and orders Liddy to, quote, go back into the Watergate, unquote. Thursday, later that week, the 15th of June, 1972, the telephone company does a sweep of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate. No electronic biking devices are found. Then, 2 days later, Saturday, 17 June 1972, 5 burglars are arrested at 2:30 a.m. in the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. McCord, Barker, Sturgis, Eugenio Martinez, and Virgilio Gonzalez. All 5 men have a history of being employed by the CIA. CIA veteran James McCord has had to tape a door latch twice to get them arrested. They have bugging equipment with them, and several of the men have in their possession amazingly traceable $100 bills that will trace them back to the White House. Bernard Barker has the phone number of E. Howard Hunt on him, indicating another connection to the White House. Almost at once, the men start. I mean, you almost look at this and you go, well, this is a setup, right? I mean, it's almost too good. Almost at once, the men start claiming to authorities that they had broken in weeks earlier, on May 28, 1972, and were there to, quote unquote, fix failures from the purported first break in, which didn't happen, mainly electronic bugs. I can't make this stuff up. Note, but there was no first break in, and the phone company had just days before found there were no bugs in DNC headquarters. So if it didn't really happen, just lie about it and say that it did. The amazing amount of obvious evidence on the men soon leads investigators to Liddy, Hunt, and Baldwin, who are also linked to the purported Memorial Day weekend, quote unquote, first break in. I'm talking about a bunch of bumblers, providing them with an alibi for their whereabouts during that weekend. CIA Director Richard Helms claims to have been preparing for bed at 3 a.m. when he gets a call from CIA Chief of Secretary Howard Osborne informing Helms that, quote unquote, district police have picked up 5 men in a break in. Helms is told that McCord is one of them, along with 4 Cubans, quote unquote. Osborne also purportedly tells Helms that, quote, Howard Hunt also seems to be involved in some way, unquote. Helms purportedly asks Osborne, quote, is there any indication that we could be involved in this, unquote, and is told, quote, none whatsoever, unquote. Next, still, and this is a quote, still sitting on the edge of the bed, unquote, Helms calls acting director of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray. This is the guy who doesn't have any any police background at all, who is, quote, in a Los Angeles hotel room, unquote. Gray says that he's been informed of the break-in but has no details. Helms tells Gray that despite the background of the apparent perpetrators, the CIA had nothing to do with the break-in. Oh, gosh. Planet Earth. Saturday, 18 June 1972. Ingo Swann flies to Northfield, Minnesota, which is out in the middle of nowhere. I've been there, to give lectures at the annual retreat of Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship. And in 1972, that was double the middle of nowhere. Thursday, 22 June 1972, Charles Colson is interrogated by the FBI on the Watergate break-in. After interrogating Colson, the FBI is of the belief that the break-in is, quote, a CIA thing. So you get this thing where the CIA and the FBI, two opposing forces in the same government. Acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray has a meeting about 5 o'clock with S.A. Bates, the Assistant Director in charge of the General Investigative Division of the FBI. Following the meeting, Gray places a telephone call to Richard Helms, Director of CIA, to, quote, tell him our thoughts that we may be poking into a CIA operation in connection with the Watergate burglary, unquote. Helms tells Gray that Helms has been meeting with his men on this every day, and that although we know the people, we cannot figure this one out. But there is no CIA involvement. Helms then meets with Gray and asks Gray not to interview the two CIA men. Gray asks Gray issues the order. Gray calls FBI S.A. Bates immediately following that visit from Helms and tells Bates that there was some CIA involvement here, that we should proceed very gingerly and very discreetly and carry out the investigation at the Banco International, and also continue to try to trace these checks through the correspondent banks, but to hold off interviewing Mr. Ogario. Later that evening, Gray meets with John Dean. He tells Dean that Richard Helms has said, quote, there is no CIA involvement. Well, people just lying all over the place here. Friday, 23 June 1972, 10:04 to 10:39 a.m. Now we're getting into a series of events on the 23rd of June 1972 in a specific timeline. So 10:04 to 11:39, in an Oval Office conversation, President Nixon says, quote, the FBI agents who are working the case at this point feel that what it is, this is CIA. We protected Helms from one hell of a lot of things. This involves these Cubans hunting a lot of hanky-panky that we have nothing to do with ourselves, unquote. Ehrlichman answers that after interviewing Charles Colson, the FBI, quote, are now convinced it is a CIA thing. Now, at 11:06 a.m., acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray has a phone conversation with John Dean. Dean tells Gray that if the FBI persists in investigating the Mexican money chain, they will be, quote, be uncovering or become involved in CIA operations. Gray tells Dean that the CIA Director Richard Helms told Gray the day before there is no CIA involvement in the Watergate break-in. Gray also tells Dean if there is CIA involvement, let the CIA tell us. This just sounds like high school. No, Nixon and Haldeman are still in their meeting, which goes on until 11:39 a.m. 2:19 p.m. on the 23rd of June, 1972, Dean calls Gray to find out if Gray has made an appointment with the Deputy CIA Director, Vernon Walters. Gray hasn't. Dean tells Gray that Walters will be calling Gray for an appointment and Gray should see him. Then at 2:20 to 2:45 p.m. on the 23rd of June, 1972, Haldeman reports to Nixon that he and Ehrlichman and John Dean have met with the CIA Director Helms and Deputy Director Vernon Walters. Helms has said, quote, we'll be very happy to be helpful, but Walters has said, I don't know whether we can do it, unquote. Walters, though, is going to put in a call to Patrick Gray. Now, it's also important to note outside of this timeline, acting FBI Director L. Patrick and CIA Welts, Gray soon will destroy crucial evidence taken from the White House safe of CIA's golden boy, E. Howard Hunt. Now, at 2:35 p.m., Vernon Walters meets with L. Patrick Gray. Walters says that if the FBI proceeds with the investigation of the Mexican money chain, they would uncover CIA assets and resources and could interfere with some CIA covert activities. Walter then, well, then don't be covert and don't be doing things you shouldn't be doing. I mean, this withholds. Walters then mentions to Gray the agreement between the agencies not to uncover one another's sources, saying further the FBI has the 5 people and that the matter ought to be tapered off there. Now, about 10 minutes later, on the 23rd of June, after meeting with Walters, Gray calls John Dean and tells Dean that Walters has indicated that there is, quote, some CIA involvement, unquote, and that they will, quote, proceed very gingerly and very discreetly and work around this until we can determine what we have a hold of. On the same day, an airgram is sent from the American Embassy in Copenhagen to the U.S. State Department. And I know you're wondering, how does all of this tie in? From the legal attaché, Copenhagen, titled Subject L. Ron Hubbard, FPC. Its contents are unknown. The only record of this airgram is a later memorandum dated 5 September 1972 to Acting Director of FBI L. Patrick Gray, enclosing a copy of the airgram saying it is self-explanatory. So Scientology is definitely involved in this, and I don't say involved, but they're part of the subject matter of this whole thing. Clearly, Saturday, 24 June 1972, according to Ingo Swann, he arrives in Washington, D.C. from Minnesota. Remember that trip he took to the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, for the meeting, ostensibly to do book research at the Library of Congress, unquote. But Swann says elsewhere that his trip to D.C. in 1972 was to discuss psi phenomena with a variety of officials. Then, Tuesday, 27 June 1972, Hal Putoff contacts Kay Green, Office of Strategic Intelligence, OSI at the CIA, informing Green of the results of the Varian Hall magnetometer experiment that Ingo Swann did, we mentioned earlier. There are also subsequent conversations between Putoff and CIA personnel regarding this event. On the 28th, next day, Wednesday, L. Patrick Gray gets a call from the CIA Director Richard Helms, who asks Gray not to interview active CIA man Carl Wagner and John Caswell. Gray immediately orders that the interviews of Caswell and Wagner be held in abeyance. Caswell and Wagner's names have been found in a telephone address notebook belonging to E. Howard Hunt. Boy, this Howard Hunt has his fingers in everything. In the evening, John Dean turns over some of the items to the White House safe of E. Howard Hunt to Gray. Gray is provided with a large brown envelope to carry the items away in. Dean tells Gray that included papers have, quote, national security implications, unquote, saying they should, quote, never see the light of day, unquote. Gray purportedly never looks at the papers, but takes them to his apartment in Washington, D.C., and puts them on a closet shelf under his shirts. Gray has a meeting with Mark Felt and S.A. Bates on the CIA ramifications, unquote. On the 30th of June, 1972, Hal Putoff, OT7, supposedly says in a letter to Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler in New York that he has, quote, obtained a contract to investigate the primary perception hypotheses of Cleve Baxter. Next day, 1 July 1972, the Classified Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA report entitled Controlling Offensive Behavior, USSR, is published. Though its findings have been known by top personnel for months, in part it states the Soviet Union is well aware of the benefits and applications of parapsychology research. The term parapsychology denotes a multidisciplinary field consisting of the sciences of bionics, biophysics, psychophysics, psychology, physiology, and neuropsychology. Many scientists, US and Soviet, feel that parapsychology can be harnessed to create conditions where one can alter or manipulate the minds of others. The major impetus behind the Soviet drive to harness the possible capabilities of telepathic communication, telekinetic, and bionics are said to come from the Soviet military and the KGB. And this is in brackets, Committee of State Security Secret Police. That's what the KGB is. Soviet knowledge in this field is superior to that of the US, the document says. The potential applications of focusing mental influences on an enemy through hypnotic telepathy have surely occurred to the Soviets. Controlled and manipulation of the human consciousness must be considered a primary goal. Soviet efforts in the field of psi research sooner or later might enable them to do some of the following. A. Know the contents of top secret U.S. documents, the movements of our troops and ships, and the location and nature of our military installations. B. Mold the thoughts of key U.S. military and civilian leaders at a distance. C. Cause the instant death of any U.S. official at a distance. D. Disable at a distance U.S. military equipment of all types, including a spacecraft. Now, on the same day, Yvonne Gilliam Jensch, executive director of Scientology Celebrity Center, is married, wait for it, is married to Heber Jensch, who is the president of the Church of Scientology later on, not at this time, who he himself later on in the next decade, mysteriously late in the next decade in the 80s, mysteriously disappears under the command of David Miscavige. Despite running an organization with over 200 staff members and a grueling schedule, including appearances around the U.S. and several foreign countries, Yvonne has standing orders with her office and public relations staff to locate her wherever she is if a call should come in for her for her from Hal Putoff or Ingo Swann. Boy. Note, according to staff members who contributed the information, Yvonne Jensch had no specific knowledge at the time of Swann or Putoff's connections with the CIA or NSA, only that they both had contact with various influential people, and possibly even was the belief that their connections were related somehow to NASA and the space race, but not military intelligence. I find that hard to believe. Monday, 3 July 1972. According to one of several conflicting accounts told by L. Patrick Gray, he burns the papers given to him by John Dean that had been taken from the safe of E. Howard Hunt in a wastebasket in his office at the FBI. Note, Gray later retracts this story, saying that he kept the papers first in his apartment, then moved them to his office, then to his home, where he burned them on or around 27 December 1972. Gray has another meeting with Mark Felt, Bates, and also Mr. Kunkel, the special agent in charge of the Washington field office, on the CIA ramifications of the Watergate break-in. Now, the next week, 17 July 1972, a Monday, a sum equivalent to US $1,119,678 in Swiss francs is withdrawn in cash by Fred Hare and Vicky Polameni from a trust fund of questionable origin. This is where this all comes back together here. Of questionable origin in Switzerland, and purportedly is brought aboard the flagship Apollo and put into a safe. Note, conflicting accounts in the same reference tax court ruling say that the amount was over $2 million, quote unquote, and also say the cash was put into, quote, a file cabinet in a strong room instead of a safe. The same ruling also provides no accounting of what happened to the actual cash. Just went missing. A little over $1 million. Poof. Wednesday, 19 July 1972, Fred LaRue gives $40,000 to Herbert W. Kalmbach, who takes it to New York and gives it to Anthony Ulaszewicz. Ulaszewicz delivers $40,000 to Dorothy Hunt, wife of E. Howard Hunt, and $8,000 to G. Gordon Liddy in unmarked envelopes left in lockers at Washington National Airport. The next week, 26 July 1972, a report is issued entitled, quote, Report of an Out-of-Body Experiment Conducted at the American Society for Psychical Research. Participants Dr. Carol Silfen, Janet Mitchell, Ingo Swann, unquote. The report describes an out-of-body experiment that suggests that a point of perception exterior to the body is able to assume, quote, at a different location the functions performed by the visual system in the brain and the body, unquote. This is the first such experiment that verified the capability of such remote points of view. Now, you need to keep in mind in listening to this one heck of a timeline that's spread all over the place, that almost all of this on the American side of things was started by Scientology subject matter, and it's just spreading out into the Black Ops community and everything like that. So is it any wonder that Scientology was attacked? Well, there you go. Monday, 7 August 1972, Ingo Swann flies to San Francisco and is met by OT7 Hal Putoff. Putoff gives Swann an envelope containing an unspecified amount of cash and a copy of their 3-week schedule. They are to have a 1-week informal period and then a 2-week formal setup. The latter 2-week segment will be attended by 2 CIA representatives. Then, that following Friday, the 11th of August, 1972, Ingo Swann flies to Los Angeles for the weekend with psychiatrist Shafika Karagula and her quote-unquote associate, even though he has come to SRI specifically to perform experiments in the presence of CIA personnel. No reason is given for the trip. Coragula is a neurosurgeon and has studied under Canadian psychiatrist Wilder Penfield, infamously known for putting electrical probes in the brains of conscious subjects. This is all stuff LRH talked about long before this. And it's stunning, absolutely stunning to me that the connections between Heber Jentzsch's wife and the church and possibly whoever else, that you have these psychiatrists in the middle of this whole thing, and Ingo Swann can just walk into Celebrity Center whenever he wants. It's just the weirdest thing to me. Monday, 14 August 1972, Swann is back at SRI after his trip to Los Angeles with psychiatrist Coragula and is ready to begin a 2-week formal experiments in the company of 2 representatives from CIA. To me, if LRH knew that this was going on, I just, what? And I don't think that he did. But this is just, it's just so stunning. On the 23rd of August, 1972, a Wednesday, a CIA project officer contracts Hal Putoff for a demonstration with Ingo. Swann is asked to describe objects hidden out of sight by CIA personnel. The descriptions are so, quote, startlingly accurate that Swann purportedly is asked if he will complete the necessary forms, quote, for a security clearance, unquote. Note, Swann is already on record as having a top security clearance. The guy has a top security clearance, and he can walk into any Scientology advanced organization or celebrity center, and Yvonne Jentzsch is interested in hearing from him whenever he contacts her. I call bullshit. This is there's some more involvement in this than meets the eye. That this, you can't have a security clearance and be in the church. Even then, back when things were decent, somewhat decent, but maybe not as decent. You be the judge. He agrees to do it once he gets back to New York, quote, where his papers are, unquote. The CIA rep suggests to CIA that the work be continued and expanded. CIA's Sidney Gottlieb reviews the data, approves another work order, and encourages the development of, quote, a more complete research plan, unquote. Saturday, 26 July 1972, a couple days later, Swann returns to New York from SRI. He prepares the application for security clearance and sends it off to Hal Putoff, even though he already had a security clearance. Weird. Wednesday, 30 August 1972, a one sentence letter is received by the FBI. It says, "Did you receive the printed matter that was sent to you concerning Scientology? If so, please acknowledge. Thank you." Note, in the released FBI copy, the signature is blacked out. The letter is answered 2 days later, on the 1st of September, which we'll get there in just a moment, by acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray. September 1972, no date. The Scientology flagship Apollo is moved to Spain for refit. The crew and officers are given the story that L. Ron Hubbard is still, quote, living ashore, unquote, to account for his absence. So he was MIA at this point in time. Friday, 1 September 1972, acting director of FBI Patrick Gray responds to a one-sentence letter that we just mentioned. Your letter was received as the reply on August 30th. With respect to your inquiry, a search of our records does not reveal any prior communication from you, quote, unquote. Note, in the released FBI copy, the address block and the person's name is blacked out, and the letter has a note at the bottom, quote, correspondent is not identifiable in bureau files, unquote. Then Tuesday, the next week, 5 September 1972, the FBI acting director, L. Patrick Gray, receives a memorandum from legal attaché, subject L. Ron Hubbard, FPC, regarding an airgram sent to the State Department on the 23rd of June, 1972. It says, enclosed are single copies of an airgram dated 6/23/72 captioned "The Church of Scientology in Denmark," from the American Embassy, Copenhagen, to the U.S. Department of State, which is self-explanatory. Note, copies go to Foreign Liaison, Legat Madrid, and Copenhagen. Friday, 15 September 1972, Hunt, Liddy, McCord, and the Watergate burglars are indicted by the federal grand jury. The involvement of McCord and Liddy provides investigators with a link to the Nixon campaign. The involvement of E. Howard Hunt provides investigators with a link to the White House. How convenient. Tuesday, 19 September 1972, Anthony Ulasevich Anthony Ulasevich flies to Washington, D.C. and delivers $53,000 cash to Dorothy Hunt, wife of E. Howard Hunt, and $29,000 to Fred LaRue by leaving unmarked envelopes in a locker at Washington International Airport and the lobby of a motel near LaRue's residence. Saturday, 30 September 1972, according to one of the conflicting stories he told at the end of September, acting director of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray, takes files that had been in E. Howard Hunt's White House safe to his home in Stonington, Connecticut, and puts them in a chest of drawers, intending to burn them. So obviously, somebody or E. Howard Hunt gave him the code to get into the safe. On 1 September 1972, on a Sunday, CIA's Technical Services Division awards Hal Putoff a top-secret research contract to develop quote-unquote remote viewing for military espionage purposes. Note, TSD is the CIA division formerly known as Technical Services Staff, unquote. TSD is also the division running, wait for it, MK Ultra. What a coincidence. The head of TSD is Sidney Gottlieb. The name of TSD will change a month after this contract to, quote, Office of Technical Services. Its acronym is OTS. OTS is a pun. So let me go over that again. This is really, really important. On 1 October 1972, on a Sunday, the CIA's Technical Services Division awards Hal Putoff. This is one of the guys that's in the church that rose into the OT levels and everything, had security clearances and everything else, and mysteriously was able to get on the OT levels, rewards him a contract to develop remote viewing for military espionage purposes. Note, TSD is the CIA division formerly known as Technical Services Staff. TSD is also the division that is running the MK Ultra program. Boom. The head of TSD is Sidney Gottlieb. The name of TSD will change a month after this contract to Office of Technical Services. Its acronym OTS is a pun. Wow. November 1972, CIA Director Richard Helms calls L. Patrick Gray's number 2 man, unquote, Mark Felt, stating that Helms is going to call Assistant Attorney General Peterson regarding the interview of CIA's Carl Wagner to see if it could, quote, could not be conducted and be held off. CIA's Sidney Gottlieb retires. The name of CIA's TSD is changed to Office of Technical Services. Sunday, 3 December 1972. L. Ron Hubbard purportedly goes into hiding in New York in the company of Green Beret Paul Preston. So LRH is in New York. Scientology OT7 Hal Putoff and Ingo Swann, now under contract with the CIA under the MK Ultra program, run into, go figure, Pat Price, Scientology OT3, who purportedly is selling Christmas trees at a lot in Mountain View, California, close to SRI. Putoff is reported to, quote, have met Price. Just picking up a Christmas tree. Several years later, quote unquote, at a lecture in Los Angeles. Note, Los Angeles is the location of Scientology's advanced organization, AOLA, and the only place in the U.S. at the time where OT levels are delivered. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Friday, 8 December, remember the gal that had the money? The wife of E. Howard Hunt? E. Howard Hunt's wife, Dorothy Hunt, is killed in a United Airlines airplane crash of Flight 533 as it approaches Chicago. Dorothy Hunt's purse contains $10,585 in cash, most of it in $100 bills. Thursday, 21 December 1972. OT7 Ingo Swann arrives to begin his CIA contract at Stanford Research Institute, now under the banner of MK Ultra. James W. McCord writes a letter to Jack Caulfield that says, in part, if Helms goes and if the WG Watergate operation is laid at the CIA's feet where it does not belong, every tree in the forest will fall. It will be a scorched desert. The whole matter is at the precipice right now. Just pass the message that if they want it to blow, they are on exactly the right course, unquote. Caulfield replies, I have worked with these people and I know them to be as tough-minded as you. Don't underestimate them. And that ends 1972, just 1972, of all of this back and forth, MK Ultra, remote viewing, LRH disappearing, on and on and on. There's a lot more to follow on this. I hope you're sticking with me. Listening to this episode and not listening to the earlier episodes is going to be really confusing for you. It's a long and very sordid tale. I hope you've enjoyed this particular installment of the podcast on what happened to Scientology. We'll continue with another one probably tomorrow, and I'll get that posted. We've got many years to go. It starts to thin out here a little bit, but I promise you, it comes to a very, very interesting close of what happened to Scientology. So stick with us. Catch the next episode. Feel free to comment on YouTube or send us a text message on our podcast account, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. See you tomorrow. Namaste, and we love you. Bye-bye.